morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all so very much for joining us today. Your interest and attendance of our live streams as demonstrations of civic engagement are so important. Our Q&A sessions are integral to our mission and the rights and freedoms in our Constitution. Our live streams are presented as a public service. There is no admissions charge. Today, Americans from across the nation and throughout California are viewing our programs. With the current spotlight on civic engagement and the need for continued conversations about our democracy and its future, I invite you to become a member of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. You can sign up to become a member and view all of the benefits on our website, lawacth.org. We will be taking questions in about 25 minutes. For those of you who are new to Dan's program, you can submit your questions by entering them on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Our Vice President, Jessica DeGanzik, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion in about 25 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to introduce politics professor Dan Schnur and his weekly program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Dan, we should share with the audience, we were just talking a few minutes ago about the lack of news for your programs. There's so much breaking news. It's difficult to see how we can cover everything in an hour, but you do everything so beautifully. So we're so eager about that. Dan has three terrific topics to focus on today. And I know there'll be many, many more that come out of all of your questions. First topic is Trump's final days, what to expect before January 20th, Biden's priorities, the new president's challenges and opportunities, and where does the GOP go next? So Dan, please take it away. We need you more than ever. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Kim. And thanks as always to all for this weekly conversation. As I think many of you know, just as a reminder, and we'll remind you at the end of today's program and on email through the week, next week we're going to be shifting this webinar, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, from our current Thursday morning time slot to Tuesday mornings at 11 a.m. Pacific time. So the advantage next week is we'll be having a pre-inauguration edition of the webinar. And then after that, going forward, starting on January 19th, but then going on into the future, from that point forward, we'll be meeting on Tuesday mornings rather than Thursday. But as always, if you're not able to attend, if you have other pressing matters that keep you from joining us live, just a reminder that if you register, you'll get a reminder email from our team at LA World Affairs Council Town Hall, and they'll send you a link that allows you to watch the discussion at your leisure over the course of the week. As more and more people's lives get back to something even remotely resembling normal, we found that more and more of you tend to watch this program in the evenings or even on the weekends, rather than at 11 o'clock on a weekday morning. Either way, though, we're thrilled to have you. As Kim mentioned, we do have quite a bit to talk about this week. And just to get the conversation going, let's take a step back and think about where we are at this incredible, extraordinary, unique moment in American history. Yesterday, our country's president was impeached for the second time. That's never happened before in our history. There are currently troops occupying the US Capitol for the first time in about 150 years. And the next president's inauguration, to a large degree, is being overshadowed by the prospect of the last president's conviction. So as Donald Trump prepares to leave office, and as Joe Biden prepares for his swearing in next week, there's a lot going on. So let's try to unpack it best we can. So as all of you know, of course, President Trump was impeached yesterday by the House of Representatives for his role in encouraging last week's riots. It now appears that the Senate will convene to hold a trial on whether to convict him. but it also looks as if that trial will not occur until after Trump leaves office, and that raises all sorts of constitutional questions, which we can get into a little bit later, should you care to. But Senator Mitch McConnell, who's currently the Senate Majority Leader until next Friday, the 22nd, at which point he'll become the Senate Minority Leader, McConnell makes the case that the Senate cannot act on the House's impeachment until the Senate's next working day, which ironically enough is next Tuesday, January 19th, the day before the inauguration. So it appears at this point that the actual trial itself may begin the morning of January 20th, Inauguration Day, although no substantive proceedings would take place until sometime after that. Holding a conviction trial as Joe Biden prepares to take office would be politically difficult. And from a security standpoint, it now appears that there will be 20,000 National Guard troops present in Washington for the swearing-in next week. So not only would beginning the trial in a substantive way next week be politically difficult for the incoming president, but from a security standpoint, it would pretty much be impossible under these current conditions. So Trump's trial, as I mentioned a moment ago, will almost certainly happen once he is the former president. And there is already an emerging debate about whether the Senate has jurisdiction to convict him or not, or to hold a trial to convict him or not once he's left office. But it appears at this point that both Senators McConnell and Schumer, the current and future majority leaders, do believe that the Senate has that authority. So that's their plan for right now. Now, as most of us have learned in the last several days, the conviction of an impeached president by the United States Senate, which has never happened before in American history, is designed not only to remove that president from office, but to lay the groundwork to prohibit that president from ever running for elective office again. But in addition to the practicalities of perhaps prohibiting Trump from running for office again for president in 2024, for example, there's also an argument among many of the president's critics and others who favor impeachment that Congress should take advantage of the opportunity to send a clear message to the country and to history that Trump's actions cannot be tolerated and must be formally condemned through an official conviction. So even if Trump is out of office by the time this trial concludes, it could still serve these two purposes. The question is whether it could succeed. The Senate must vote by a 2/3 majority to convict, and that would require 17 Republican senators to join in, presumably with 50 Democratic senators, to achieve the necessary threshold for a conviction. Now, last year, during Trump's first impeachment, only one Republican, Mitt Romney, voted to convict. Now it appears there were at least 5 who would be ready to do so. In addition to Romney, Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Ben Sasse of Nebraska, and Patrick Toomey of Pennsylvania have all indicated that they may vote for a conviction if and when the time comes. But McConnell himself, of course, has let it be known that he was pleased, quote unquote, to see the House impeach Trump. And he has said publicly he is undecided on how he would vote. So getting from 5 Republicans to 17 is a pretty big jump. But people who watch the Senate very carefully believe that if McConnell were to vote to convict Trump, he could probably bring along another dozen Republicans with him. And so that makes a conviction of Donald Trump very, very plausible. So those votes are probably still some time away, but it's never too early to speculate on this, of course. So Claire, if you can, let's put up our first question and let's see what our group thinks about this. So question for all of you, pretty simple and straightforward. Does Mitch McConnell, when the time comes, does Mitch McConnell vote to convict Donald Trump or not? What do you think, yes or no? Let us know. And Claire, when you have the results, let's see what our smart group has to say about McConnell's vote projecting forward. Whoa, this is a close one. Our group is not usually this divided. We generally tend to come to a pretty strong conclusion. but by the narrow margin of 54% to 46%. Our group, at least, LA World Affairs Council Town Hall Smart People, think that McConnell will vote for the conviction. So let's put up the logical follow-up question then, if we can, Claire. So if McConnell votes for the conviction, do you believe that Trump will then be convicted by the Senate? In other words, will McConnell bring along a dozen or more other Republicans with him, or is that a little bit much? Now, before you vote, see that we have three options here. Will Trump be convicted by the Senate? One, yes, before the inauguration. Will this move more quickly than expected? Number two, you believe he will be convicted, but not until after Joe Biden is sworn in as president. Or third, you say no, the impeachment will stand, but the Senate will not convict Trump. So let's see how we did in terms of responses. 1% say before the inauguration, so that is still technically a possibility, but unlikely. And once again, a fairly split vote. 54% think that Trump will be convicted after Biden becomes president. 45% don't believe the Senate will take that step. Now, a couple things to keep in mind as you watch this discussion go forward. Only 10 Republicans in the House voted to impeach Trump yesterday, but one of them was especially important, and that's Liz Cheney. Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming is the number 3 ranking member in the House leadership after Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise. She's the chair of the House Republican Conference. And of course, she's the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney. Liz Cheney was one of those votes. And even though a lot of more mainstream establishment traditional Republicans did not vote for the impeachment yesterday, the fact that Cheney did sends a signal that there are a growing number of more traditional Republicans who are no longer as afraid of Trump as they have been for much of the last 4 years. It's worth remembering that roughly 70 House Republicans, about 40% of the caucus, voted to confirm the Electoral College last week when they voted in the aftermath of the Capitol riots. And so while Trump is still a very dominant force in the Republican Party, of course, and will continue to be, it does look like his grip might be lessening just a little bit. Now let's move our attention from the House to the Senate. It's worth remembering that most members of the House of Representatives, whether Republican or Democrat, represent very safe districts. That's the gift of gerrymandering. And what that means is if you represent a very safe district for your party, Republican or Democrat, that means you're almost never going to have to worry about losing a general election campaign. The one thing you do have to worry about, as we see with increasing frequency, is a member of either party losing a contested primary to a more conservative Republican or a more liberal Democrat. And so that may have kept a lot of the House members in line with Trump yesterday. But senators, on the other hand, represent entire states, and they tend to have to balance broader interests than just those of a district. And while certainly a number of senators represent very deep red or very deep blue states, the question going forward is whether there are enough Republicans in swing states who might be up for re-election in 2022 or 2024, who would join the 5 or 6 people we've talked about earlier and vote for conviction. But ultimately, this is going to come down to McConnell, and your votes to the first 2 poll questions demonstrate that you know that. I don't pretend to know what's going to happen, but remember this: as of next Thursday, as of January 21st, Mitch McConnell's top priority becomes the 2022 midterm Senate elections and his efforts to regain the Senate majority for the Republicans. Now, while the Democrats have more seats up next year, Republicans are facing several retirements and very difficult challenges in many key swing states. Now, many traditional Republican financial contributors, as many of you have read, have already indicated that they won't give money to any candidate who voted against the Electoral College results. Mitch McConnell understands that if he wants to bring back those corporate donors and bring back a lot of the swing voters who've been put off by Trump's conduct over the last couple months, he has to find a way to distance the Republican Party of 2022 from Donald Trump's Republican Party. And there's no better way to distance the Republican Party from Donald Trump than for a significant number of Republican senators to vote to convict him. So I don't know where McConnell will come down, but it goes without saying that we should keep an eye on him going forward. Let's move on now. Let's move on now to Joe Biden. And it's a mark of how unusual the times we're living in have become that under more normal circumstances, if a president-elect was preparing to take office and was going to deliver a very important policy speech tonight, as Joe Biden will, that would be dominating public and media conversation. And of course, it's somewhat of an afterthought. Here we are almost 15 minutes into our program. We're just getting to Joe Biden. And so this is a challenge that Biden faces, not just for the next week, but going forward. He needs the bully pulpit that comes with the presidency. He understands that every new president has a limited window of opportunity to convince the American people to support his most pressing policy goals. And Biden has no shortage of urgent matters to address. He talked a lot about the need for bipartisan unity during the campaign last year. And it's beginning to look like in the eyes of some of Biden's supporters that convicting a Republican president is not the best way to get Republicans in Congress to support the policy goals. So Biden wants to be a uniter. He needs to pass a COVID relief package, among many other things. And it's very clear from his body language and the hints he's been given, although he's been careful in how he phrases it, that he doesn't really seem to want this impeachment trial interfering with his first weeks in office. Now, congressional Democrats believe otherwise. They think this is important to do for a matter of justice, but they also think it's something that can help and can bolster the new president. But what do you think? Claire, can we put up the next question and see what our group thinks? Question for all of you to consider and vote on. Will impeachment of Trump and a conviction trial in the Senate, I should add, will that trial help Biden or will it hurt him? Option one, it'll help Biden by holding Trump accountable. Option two, it'll harm Biden by making it harder for him to unify the country. Or three, it won't make any difference. It won't really help or hurt him to a great degree. What does everyone think? Look at that, also a pretty close vote. 33%, exactly 1/3 of you, say it will help Biden by holding Trump accountable. 38% say it'll harm Biden, that it makes it harder for him to unify the country. And 28% say no difference. Now, Biden has a lot on his plate. Economic recovery, infrastructure, immigration, taxes, healthcare, minimum wage, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. But obviously, his top focus will be on the coronavirus. It has to be. And specifically, and this is what he'll be talking about tonight when he gives his speech on the topic, Biden will be laying out his legislative package to support economic relief, vaccinations, and other funding for coronavirus relief. Yet another challenge for Biden is that there's been some tension among Democrats as to how expansive, how ambitious should his COVID bill be. Some Democrats want a proposal that's much more aggressive, but some of the centrists in the party want to proceed much more incrementally. And we'll talk more about this in just a minute. Before we get into the details of what Biden may propose, I'd like to get your sense of the balance of power in the Democratic Party. So Claire, if we can put up our next question. Who will be most excited about the Biden COVID relief bill? Will it be progressives because it's very aggressive and expansive? Will it be centrists because it's more careful and because it's designed to attract Republican support? Will both factions of the Democratic Party be excited by it? Or will neither side be that excited? What do we think? What do you think? Interesting. Oh, Claire, can you put those back up for a sec? Great, thank you. Only 7% say that this is a package that's really going to excite the Democratic base. About a quarter, 24%, say it will be more appealing to centrists, the so-called establishment Democrats. 61% of you believe that Biden will be able to straddle that gap and bring the two wings of his party together. and 8% say nope, neither one of those sides is going to be all that excited. Now, as we've discussed in the past, Biden originally put together a legislative COVID relief package that was designed to attract bipartisan support. And I suspect that that's why the votes that you guys just cast turned out the way they did. But it's been reported over the last few days that Chuck Schumer, the incoming majority leader, and Bernie Sanders, who's going to be the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, have successfully convinced Biden that the package is not large enough to address the country's needs during such desperate times. So while Biden is likely to announce a smaller package tonight that's designed to attract possible Republican votes, you can bet that he'll be following up with a second, much larger proposal after taking office, something that in all likelihood would pass on a straight party line vote, with 51 Democrats, including Kamala Harris, voting for, and 50 Republicans voting against. So tonight's announcement, from what we understand, will focus more narrowly on vaccination funding, on stimulus, and on unemployment compensation. But there will be more to come. And my educated guess is that when we talk about Biden's next COVID relief package, your responses are going to indicate a much greater level of enthusiasm among party progressives than among centrists. Now, this is a challenge that Biden's been facing since he began his candidacy. On one hand, he has to attract support from swing voters, but he also has to keep Democratic progressives motivated. It's reasonable to assume that's why he hasn't spoken out against the impeachment proceedings, because he needs his base to be enthusiastic. And a centrist bill on COVID relief might not inspire them. So tonight looks like it could be the first in a two-part balancing act that Biden tries to achieve on this critical issue. So third and finally, we'll talk for the last few minutes of the first half of the program before we open it up to your questions and ideas. But I want to talk for just a little bit before we get to the bottom of the hour about our third topic, the future of the Republican Party, and whether it has the potential now to split into two parties, as Donald Trump's last legacy for the party that he's led over the last 4 years. So make no mistake about it, there are now two Republican parties. One is pro-Trump, and the other you might refer to as pre-Trump, more traditional Republican conservatives who may have fallen in the line behind the president, but have never been all that excited about him. So one of those two parties will continue to support the president even after he leaves office. The other party, which is growing, very badly wants to move on. The first of those two parties, the pro-Trump party, is headed by the Republican leader of the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy. And the pre-Trump party, for a while quietly, but now more visibly, is headed by the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. So let's talk a little bit about the McCarthy party and the McConnell party and see how they break down. So Axios, the very smart political website, took a poll this week. And what they found as it relates to Republicans is the following. They found a very deep divide within the Republican Party between the McConnell and the McCarthy wings. They found 56% of their Republican respondents referring to themselves as quote unquote traditional Republicans, and 36% calling themselves Trump Republicans. So that's a fairly sizable advantage for what we'll call the pre-Trump traditional Republicans. But know this, 2 months ago, right after the election, those numbers were almost exactly reversed. In November, more than half of Republicans called themselves Trump Republicans, and only a little bit more than a third called themselves traditional Republicans. So that's a big shift, an almost exact flip over the last 60 days. Now, these two groups hold very, very different views on removing the president from office, on contesting the election, and on the future of their party. But even though they're a smaller faction, the Trump Republicans tend to behave with a lot more unity, and as we've seen in the past, a lot more intensity. About 25%, about a quarter of traditional Republicans now think that Trump should be removed from office. Only 1% of Trump Republicans do. Traditional Republicans, on the question of whether the party is better or worse because of Trump, they're pretty much split, 50-50 almost. 96% of Trump Republicans think the party's better because of him. Trump Republicans are more than twice as likely as traditional Republicans to want him as their 2024 nominee, which is one of the reasons some of those traditional Republican senators might vote for conviction. Traditional Republicans are more than 5 times as likely to disapprove of the president's behavior. But among all Republicans, Trump is still the frontrunner for the 2024 nomination, although by a much smaller margin than in November. So this could lay the groundwork for an even larger split within the Republican Party. And it could create a situation where the Republican Party can no longer contain Trump's allies and his critics under one roof. Since the election for the last 2 months or so, a lot of more traditional Republican leaders have begun to edge away from the president. And as it became more difficult to defend Trump's challenges to the election results, the outline of the battle for control of the Republican Party became more apparent. And it looked like for the next 4 years, those traditional pre-Trump Republicans and those pro-Trump Republicans would fight for the next 4 years until the next nominee was picked. But that was before last Wednesday. And Trump's language at the rally of his supporters that morning and his disregard for the damage they caused that afternoon has deepened and widened the divide within the Republican Party by an immense degree. That small group of GOP resistors who stood against Trump in the past have now been joined by a large number of party regulars, the Mitch McConnell wing of the party. And they just simply want Donald Trump gone. They dealt with him for 4 years. They just want him out of the picture. But even the president's very greatly diminished political stature has not prevented a large number of Republican voters, activists, and elected officials from standing with him. We saw that in the poll numbers I just discussed, and we saw that in the House vote yesterday. But we should also look back at last Wednesday's votes to confirm the Electoral College. I mentioned this earlier. Dozens of Republican House members, about 40% of the caucus, voted against Trump's wishes and in favor of the Electoral College. About half the Republican senators who were going to vote to challenge the results decided not to after the riots. So once again, we're seeing Donald Trump's hold on the Republican Party loosening. The question is to what degree? And as this internal fight continues over the next 4 years, it's becoming more difficult to see how the two sides are going to be able to reconcile. How can they paper over such a fundamental disagreement on how to move forward with or without Donald Trump? And I think for the first time in the modern era, it's entirely possible to imagine one of our two major parties splitting in half as a result of irreconcilable differences. There is a McConnell party, and there is a McCarthy party. And we'll see in the weeks and months ahead whether they can come together as one again, or whether we might see a third party in American politics, as has been speculated about for many, many years. There's no way of predicting whether the Republican Party will remain intact. We'll watch that and we'll talk about it, of course. But the possibility of a Republican GOP breakup now seems very plausible. So Claire, let's put up our last question to the group and see what all of you have to say. Which of these two factions will ultimately control the GOP? Will it be the Trump supporters, the McCarthy wing of the party? Or will it be Trump opponents, the Mitch McConnell wing of the party? Or finally, there's the third option. Do you think neither side will win decisively and the battle will continue? Let's see what type of results we get. Well, look at that. 50% say Trump's opponents, so we'll call it the McConnell, Liz Cheney wing of the party, will prevail. Only 6% think that Trump supporters will ultimately control the party. And 44%, a very significant plurality, say neither side will win decisively. So let's do this. As we always do, now at the halfway point, we get to what my favorite part of the program is, where instead of me dominating the conversation, we're joined happily and luckily by Jessica DeGanzik, and joined happily as well by your smart questions about the topics we've covered over the last half an hour and other things you'd like to be talking about. So Jessica, what have we got?
Sure, we've got a lot of questions coming in. I'll try to consolidate because a lot of them are similar questions. So One of the ones that we're getting is about the option of the 14th Amendment being used instead. So I wonder if you could comment on that being an option rather than the route that the Congress is currently taking.
The 14th Amendment, as we learned in elementary school or high school, was the amendment passed immediately after the Constitution, passed immediately after the Civil War, which states very specifically that anyone born in this country becomes a citizen of the country. And in recent years, that's been debated as an issue relating to undocumented immigration into the United States. But there's a lesser known provision of the 14th Amendment, which allows Congress to vote to prohibit anyone who is engaged in treasonous behavior from seeking elective office to the Congress or the presidency. There's more details involved than that, but the broad overview is if you are a current or former office holder who has acted in a seditious or treasonous way against the United States, you're forever barred from holding office. And there's a number of smart people who believe that employing the 14th Amendment, not only against Trump, but against some of the members of Congress who appeared at that rally before the riots last Wednesday, could be prevented from seeking office in the future because of that provision of the 14th Amendment. There's considerable disagreement among legal and constitutional scholars about whether that would apply in this situation or not. Because the House chose to impeach, I suspect they decided that was the cleaner of the two options. It's unlikely at this point that even if the Senate didn't convict, that they would go back and employ the 14th Amendment because of the debate over its validity in a circumstance like this one. But it is something that Pelosi and her lieutenants thought about and discussed very, very seriously before deciding on the path of impeachment that they took yesterday.
All right. The recent Quinnipiac poll reflects that 73% of Republicans believe November's election contained widespread fraud. If extrapolated from President Trump's popular vote total, 74.2 million, that's 73% equals an amount equal to the entire statewide population of California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Nevada, and Utah combined. Can you just comment on what this means about what it means that so many of our fellow Americans do not have faith in the electoral system?
Well, it's a tremendous challenge for all of us, and it's a tremendous obstacle not only for the new president and the new Congress, but for us as a country to move forward. And in very different ways, the numbers that the questioner just cited explain, I think, to a very large degree, how both Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell have been conducting themselves since the election. Biden is staying out of the impeachment fight. He was reluctant during the campaign to talk about it, and he's been even more reluctant since Election Day, talking much more about his policy agenda and unifying the country. Because I think Biden does understand that in order to convince not all, but a relevant percentage of those who doubted the election results to come around, he has to demonstrate to them that he's not interested in continuing the fight at a high level and a visible level against the president who they think was wronged during the 2020 election. McConnell has just as great an incentive. He has to convince, just like Biden, he has to convince a large number of those doubters that even if they think there was something not on the up and up about the election, that they can't simply check out of the system and they need to be part of the process going forward too. So I think one of the reasons that McConnell is at least allowing for the idea of supporting the conviction is because he believes that if the Republican Party does separate itself from Trump, many of the traditional Republicans we talked about when citing poll numbers a few minutes ago will be willing to put aside their doubts about the 2020 election and regain the party mainstream. Now, a lot of Trump supporters say that's ridiculous. They believe that a conviction of Trump by the Senate would turn Trump into a martyr and would rally those millions of people around him and to his cause. But if you look at and listen to what both the next president and the Senate Republican leader are saying and doing, they recognize that even if all of those millions of people aren't willing to become a productive part of the conversation going forward, that there has to be something done, both by the president and by Republican leaders, to convince them to stand down and be willing to move past their doubts starting next Wednesday.
It seems unclear whether the follow-on vote to bar Trump from ever again holding office requires a 2/3 or only a majority vote following his impeachment conviction. Do you know which is true?
Sure, it's actually, oddly enough, it's actually both. It requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate to convict Trump of the impeachment that the House passed yesterday. Once that vote has taken place, if and only if Trump is convicted, it then requires 51 votes to prohibit him from running from office again. So two separate votes, different thresholds, one predicated on the other, the first requiring 2/3, the second requiring 50% plus one.
Thank you so much. Sorry, we're getting so many questions. It's jumping really quickly, so bear with me, folks. I have heard talk of a campaign to make Fox News an extra paid service for cable subscription to encourage them to stick to more truthful news and less fringe. Can you comment on that?
I have to admit, I have not heard that rumor, but I must admit that I'm somewhat skeptical of it. And it appears already, as many of you know, that some even more conservative, some even more strident pro-Trump media platforms have emerged and grown greatly in popularity recently. The One America Network and Newsmax, both of which appear on cable systems and also our online streaming platforms. And so it appears that Fox News, recognizing that there's two other entities at least looking to outflank them on the right, I think are more likely to revert to the type of coverage that they employed during the Obama administration. Now, many of our progressives who participate in these conversations each week might not have been so thrilled with that. But between 2009 and 2017, Fox acted as a critic, as a skeptic to President Obama and to his administration. I suspect they'll be returning to that role and leaving the hardcore Trump defenses to Newsmax and One America Network and others, and other potential options.
Thank you so much. This questioner says, I think Trump should be convicted, but how do you silence him permanently, in quotation marks around silence?
Well, silence is a fairly nebulous term, and I assume that the questioner does not mean it in a Tony Soprano type of way. But if we're talking simply about depriving him of a public platform from which to speak, to a large degree, that's already happened. The decisions that Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and other social media platforms have made to take his accounts away have deprived Trump of most of the opportunities he's used in the past to communicate directly with his supporters and with the broader American public. Will he still give speeches? Of course he will. Will they receive public and media attention? Certainly, although not to the level that they have during his campaigns or during his presidency. And so Donald Trump, if he so chooses, will continue to be a presence in political news going forward, but he won't be the type of outsized presence he hasn't been in the past, if only because his social media tools that he's relied on so heavily are no longer available to him.
Will Trump be fatally injured in terms of political power by all the major corporations that have withdrawn support and banks have said they will no longer loan to Trump? For example, Deutsche Bank, to which Trump owes $350 million, and the city of New York has withdrawn at least two major cash flow sources. For example, the skating rink in Central Park.
Yeah, it's very clear that Trump's most immediate threat upon leaving office is no longer a political threat. On one hand, it's a legal threat. We can talk about that separately if all of you would like, either this week or in the future. But the primary threat he faces is an economic one. He has roughly $400 million in debts, including the large majority of that to Deutsche Bank, which has announced that they will not work with him again. The real estate concern with which he's relied in the past has announced that they will not work with him. The PGA, the Professional Golfers Association, which had awarded one of his properties, one of their most high-profile events next year, has retracted it. Trump is going to be scrambling to make money. And so it's one of the reasons that the fundraising he's been doing since the election is going to be so important to him, not just to create allow him to maintain a political platform going forward, but simply to allow him to continue to lead the lifestyle which he's enjoyed in the past. I believe I mentioned this last week, but if I hadn't, I should have. In the first 2 months after the election, Donald Trump sent out more fundraising email appeals than he had in the 60 days before the election. And while those fundraising appeals talked a lot about a challenge to the presidential election, talked a lot about the Georgia Senate races, if you read the fine print of those fundraising email appeals, which most small donors did not, it was very clear that only a small percentage of that money would be used for those political purposes. And in fact, the rest of it, the overwhelming majority of it, would go to Trump's own political action committee, which can be used not only to support other candidates, but can be used to finance his own travel and his own activities.
Thank you. We have a couple questions about this social media banning. So one person said, is it not a slippery slope with the social media companies banning Trump? Another said, how should companies like Amazon and Apple be dealt with when they remove people's First Amendment rights and block free markets? Americans have been angry about censorship when it happens in other countries like China, but seem to be cheering it on in our own country.
It's a profoundly difficult question. And even Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, said yesterday that while he thought that his company made the right decision to take away Trump's account because they believed that Trump had been inciting violence and purveying inaccurate information, Dorsey made it clear he didn't like the way the decision was made. My guess, and it's just a guess going forward, is that the calls for antitrust movement against the largest social media platforms is going to intensify. We've heard from both very progressive and very conservative quarters the idea that Facebook, Twitter, Google, some of the others are simply too big and need to be broken up. And I think when you talk about questions like this, about freedom of speech, it becomes much easier to navigate the conversation if there are multiple versions of Twitter or of Facebook or of Amazon available rather than just one. And those of you who join us each week of a certain age remember when Ma Bell, the phone company, was broken up because of antitrust decisions. I think, like the phone company, like the oil companies, like the railroads, it's entirely possible to see a left-right convergence to break up these companies because they maintain too much power in many ways, but specifically, and perhaps the greatest motivator, is the power they have to provide or prevent a voice from being heard, either from the left or the right. So look for antitrust to get a big boost out of this. And the people at the largest social media companies, if I had to guess, are very cognizant that the threat to a breakup to their companies is much greater now than it was 2 weeks ago.
Thank you. Will Biden be able to keep ultra progressives and middle of the road Democrats from fighting each other?
No. And I don't say that to criticize Biden, but no president of either party, no party leader, either Democrat or Republican, has ever been able to keep the factions of their parties from fighting with each other. And so Biden, like every president of both parties who's preceded him, will end up trying to accomplish a balancing act between those wings. Most of the loudest progressive voices held their tongues during the general election campaign because they'd come to recognize in 2020, unlike in 2016, that the stakes of defeating Donald Trump were so large that they decided it was better to keep their mouth shut, help Biden get into office. Bernie Sanders in particular, who had not been particularly motivated to help Clinton in 2016, did a great deal in 2020, as did Elizabeth Warren, as did Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and other leading progressive voices, to get the base of the Democratic Party to stand up for Biden, even if he was more centrist than many party regulars. But that truce has ended. And in the months ahead and for the next 4 years, you're going to hear very loud progressive critics coming at Biden when they feel like he's trying to govern too much from the center. And you'll hear very loud centrist critics going after the president when they think he veers too far left. So Biden won't keep that fight from happening. He probably won't even really try. The best he can do, the best any president or party leader can do, is to achieve a rough balance. And the example of that, as we talked about earlier, is the way Biden is talking about COVID. He could just be announcing a centrist bipartisan package tonight and leave it at that, enraging progressives. He could have started right away with a much larger, more aggressive legislative agenda, such as the type that Schumer and Sanders want him to, and let the centrists get mad. But as I said earlier, it looks now like he's going to be starting with a smaller, less ambitious package that ideally in his mind would move forward with some bipartisan support, and then later do something more aggressive that would move forward along a straight party vote. So the answer is to try to do both. And I don't know if Biden can be successful at it, but so far at least he's navigated this challenge about as well as a party leader could, but it's only going to get more difficult for him starting next Wednesday.
What becomes of conservative never Trumpers and the Lincoln Project?
Well, I think a couple of things are going on here. First of all, the Lincoln Project itself, the small group of political operatives who ran television commercials against Trump during the campaign, they've, both in the campaign and since, believed that the Republican Party needs to be purged not just of Trump, but of his strongest supporters. So as far as they're concerned, their work is not done yet. And the loudest Trump loyalists in the party are still going to be in the crosshairs of the Lincoln Project. More broadly, the traditional conservative never Trumpers, I suspect they'll do everything they can to help Mitch McConnell move toward conviction if that's McConnell's choice. But either way, they'll begin to weigh in on behalf of more traditional conservative Republican candidates and causes in the months ahead. They'll be clustering around Republican presidential candidates like Ben Sasse, maybe like Marco Rubio, much less excited about potential alternatives like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and Lindsey Graham. But Lincoln Project aggressors notwithstanding, most of those more conservative or more traditionally conservative Republicans will become part of that McConnell effort you've heard him hinting about over the last several days.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I'm still trying to catch up with these questions. There's a lot. We have a big audience today. Do you think we will continue to see domestic terrorism during the next 4 years by Trump supporters who still think Trump won the election?
Well, I'm not a national security or law enforcement effort, but it's very clear that federal authorities are very, very concerned about those threats, not just in the days ahead, but in the months and years ahead. The photos of National Guardsmen and Guardswomen bivouacking in the US Capitol are very unsettling. And I suspect that we're going to need to get used to those types of images. But from what I understand, from what I've read and what I've heard, the most serious threat is not at the federal level, is not the US Capitol, is not the White House, because a very large National Guard presence, a US military, other security measures can be employed and will be employed, hopefully, to protect the proceedings and the participants next Wednesday and going forward. It sounds, though, like the real challenge and the real threat is with state and local governments, because there are 50 state capitals around the country, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of city halls and town hall meetings where elected officials gather. And it's simply impossible to protect all those potential targets to the greatest degree, to a degree that ensures safety for all concerned. The way I look at it myself is that while the immediate challenge is one of security, a significant public safety presence, the broader and longer challenge is not one of how many guards members or police officers stand outside a government building, but convincing this very large section of our country that there is a place for them in this country that doesn't force them to resort to violence or almost as aggressive means. And this is a challenge for all of us. Whether, regardless of the specific ideological grounding of a radical, someone who threatens or achieves violence, that's somebody who feels alienated from society. And we have to figure out collectively a way to convince those people that there's a better way to have their voice heard than what we saw last Wednesday and what we may see in state capitals and city halls going forward.
I know there was some contemplation of holding the impeachment referral for 100 days. McConnell can't initiate the trial until the impeachment is referred. Upside, focus on Biden's department heads and initial agenda. Downside, distance diminishes anger and possibility of conviction. What happened to that approach?
Well, I don't think a decision has been made on the timing of the Senate trial yet. Those who've suggested waiting for several weeks before starting the trial have faced some criticism, and the argument against them is if the threat that Donald Trump presents to the country is so urgent that the impeachment needs to be held immediately, then why is it not so urgent that the conviction trial not be held for a period of weeks or months? And so it's going to be a fine line to walk for them. It's worth noting that the member of Congress who suggested the 100-day delay was Representative Jim Clyburn of South Carolina. And as many of you remember, Representative Clyburn, probably more than any other elected official in the country, was responsible for Joe Biden's comeback during the Democratic primaries. Biden had finished very poorly in Iowa and New Hampshire. Clyburn, the senator from South Carolina, organized that state for Biden, essentially carried him to victory and put Biden back on track. Jim Clyburn and Joe Biden are very, very close friends. And while it wouldn't have made sense politically for Biden himself to suggest that delay, the fact that it was Clyburn rather than any other member of Congress makes me think that it reflects a belief among the president-elect and his advisors that they worry greatly that the impeachment is going to overshadow what the president needs to do over his first weeks in office. You probably heard Biden last week asking the question, can the Senate at least bifurcate its activities? Devote some days each week or a portion of each day to impeachment, and some days each week or a portion of each day to confirming his appointees to dealing with COVID legislation and other policy priorities. The fact that Biden asked that question tells me that he's resigned to the fact that the Trump impeachment and conviction hearings are going to create an obstacle for him to be heard in the first weeks of his presidency, and he's not thrilled with it. But waiting 100 days to get started, as Clyburn found out when he launched the trial balloon, is one that may meet real resistance also. So for Joe Biden, there's no good answer in this.
Sorry. We had several people asking, what former president benefits would Trump be stripped of if convicted through the impeachment process or barred from holding future public offices? So his security, any other protections or benefits that he would be stripped of?
Well, every former president is given a very sizable stipend. They're given a very large travel budget in addition to direct compensation. They're entitled to Secret Service protection for themselves and their families. It's entirely possible that should Trump be convicted, that the Senate could also vote to deprive him of those benefits. It's difficult to believe, even given Trump's financial difficulties, that he'd be all that in such a bad place without the stipend and the travel compensation, although he'd obviously rather have somebody else pay for it than having to pay for it himself. But the lack of security protection is something that I suspect would give him and his family much greater concern. And I wonder, and I have no evidence for this, it's just me thinking out loud, there's been a lot of speculation that Trump might decide to pardon himself before leaving office. It's been reported that some of Trump's advisors have advised him against doing that because that might make him more vulnerable to civil lawsuits after leaving office. I wonder if those same advisors might be smart enough to tell the outgoing president that choosing not to pardon himself might increase the likelihood that the Senate would not take away those benefits, and in particular, that security to which former presidents are normally entitled.
Thank you. Can Kamala be the 51st vote for prohibiting Trump from running again if he is convicted by the Senate?
Kamala Harris can be the 51st vote for anything in the Senate, including prohibiting Donald Trump from running for office. So it's logical to assume that if 17 Republicans voted to convict him, that at least one of those Republicans, if not more, would vote to prohibit him from holding office in the future. But if for some odd reason, after voting to convict him, all those Republicans then voted against a measure that would keep him from running again, Harris could and would be the 51st vote. So if that first conviction passes by 2/3, the others are all but assured. Jess, you're muted. We're not able to hear you.
So sorry. I think that brings us to the end of the hour. So I will, I guess, turn this back over to Kim. If there's any concluding remarks, Dan, I'll turn that over to you as well. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica.
Dan, thank you, Jessica. Dan, as always, for your expertise and your informative insights. We had over 1,000 people viewing you today, which was at our capacity. So we may have to change our whole contract with GoToWebinar and get larger audience capability for you going forward. So kudos.
Well, hopefully those who weren't able to join in will get the link tomorrow and will be able to watch it at some point.
I know they will. Our audience usually doubles with those who are watching you on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much for that. And thank you for today. For our viewers, you all enjoyed today's program and that you'll continue to help us make these events possible. Please consider becoming a member. There's so many benefits to it. Also, we're always open to donations. You can donate on our website or by texting the word give to the number on your screen. We can't do this without you. We have some terrific events coming up tomorrow, a conversation with U.S. Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And as Dan said, next week, his program is moving to Tuesday, same time, but we'll now be on Tuesday. And we have a members only special program following politics in the time of coronavirus, where members can call in and interact directly with Dan and ask questions that are really specific to their interests. So if you're interested in something like that, please consider becoming a member. On January 21st, we have How Technology Transforms Our Ethics conversation with futurist Juan Enriquez and UCLA professor Terry Kramer in partnership with the UCLA Anderson School of Management. On the 25th, the future of U.S. policy in Afghanistan. And February 19th, in partnership with Writer's Block, we have Bill Gates discussing his book about climate control. So we have a lot of terrific programs. So please go to our website at lawacth.org and register today. Please stay safe, stay informed, and we hope to see you tomorrow